This is Dr. Babak Azizzadeh. You are listening to the Smile Podcast, where I will be sharing with you my unique and holistic perspective on beauty, health, and wellness.
Hello. Millions of people have surgery every year.
Or you could just get a boob job.
Using targeted Botox can be a miracle.
Smiling like that is a skill.
Your surgery has been successful. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smile Podcast. I'm Dr. Azizzadeh, and today I have a very special guest, Brent Saunders, who is the former CEO and chairman of Allergan, and we're very lucky to have him. In the midst of this pandemic, he's been very, very busy in a large deal that just finished between Allergan and Abbvie. And I'm so glad that he's taken some time to talk to us about, his journey and future prospects of what coronavirus is going to impact the pharmaceutical industry. So thank you so much, Brent, for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. I know you've been busy, through this whole process. Allergan and Abbvie went through a $62 billion transaction. How were you able to manage all of that during this, unprecedented time that, the world has been going through?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And certainly, everyone is doing things that have never been done before. And there's so many great stories of people rising to the occasion and doing extraordinary things. And I think that's kind of what happened here too. I mean, both Allergan and Abbvie are great companies. Both, I think, really, despite having to do this very large integration and merger acquisition, both companies really prioritized the safety of their employees. And you're talking about, combined probably in the order of magnitude of 50,000, 60,000 employees. And that was certainly first and foremost. And then, we do make a lot of medicines that are medically necessary and important for patients in every country in the world. And so both companies really prioritized being able to supply those medically necessary medicines to patients. And then third, we all looked at how could we support customers, clearly understanding that we had to follow the rules and regulations for compliance, but what could we do to make sure that our customers knew that we were doing everything we could to try to help them in this very difficult time? And then fourth was really focus on a seamless pre-integration and merger. And so our teams all had a lot on their plate, and there was a lot to do. And of course, we were working in environments where people were working from home or dealing with homeschooling or a variety of other things, perhaps even some with sick family members or relatives. But yet, the colleagues at Allergan and Abbvie all rose to the occasion and got this done. And I think they, my 2 cents is it looks like they've done it in an extraordinarily successful manner. So I would give the credit to just great people, great teams, and extraordinary work.
And great leaders like yourself, because obviously it all trickles down, and you should be congratulated, because I know you guys, the combined company now is going to be involved in so many different aspects of, helping people, both from, ophthalmology, you have virology, you have, medical aesthetics. So it's
oncology is
powerhouse, oncology. So how do you see, Brent, kind of, this coronavirus has kind of turned the world upside down, as you said, and how do you see the pharmaceutical industry getting impacted by this coronavirus? Do you think there'll be more deals? I know your deal was initiated in the middle of last year, so it just closed, but do you see consolidation? Do you see major issues with changing focus and research, clinical trials? How do you see the changes?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some very acute areas that are impacted. So for example, clinical trials, for the most part, during the lockdown and shutdown around the world, clinical trials were either significantly slowed down or stopped because doctors' offices either weren't open or patients didn't want to go. And so the flow of being able to recruit patients into studies and or continue studies, really slowed to a trickle. So there's this kind of one-time effect of many clinical trials perhaps delayed by several months or a year for new medicines that are being studied, and that's clearly a setback, but one the industry will overcome. I think a second thing, a lot of wellness visits and routine visits and routine elective surgeries and other things like that, not just aesthetic, but people who needed a colonoscopy or a mammogram or other things like that were also ground to a halt all over the world. And so we need to really make sure that patients are also doing their well visits, doing their checkups and their diagnostics to make sure that we catch things early or prevent things from happening. And so that will be an impact on the industry. But I think more importantly, and kind of looking out a little bit more long-term or macro, I think there are two really potentially very positive things that will come out of this for our industry. One, I think that I've been saying this for years, and Allergan has been involved in this area, but anti-infective, antiviral R&D really, was forgotten by the world for the last decade or so. And, Allergan, along with a handful of other companies, were doing research in this area, but we were the exception. We focused historically on antibacterials, not antivirals, and we have developed, 3 or 4 of the most potent reserved antibacterial agents in the world, like Abbvie, which is probably one of the most important life-saving antibiotics that works on many of the resistant bacteria. But there just wasn't many companies doing it because it wasn't financially lucrative. There was not any real desire to do it, and people would rather work on things like oncology or rare diseases. And so, I think this has opened the world's eyes and NIH and governments and the pharmaceutical industry to the need to invest in antiviral, antibacterial R&D. And so that's a positive, and I think that's a lasting commitment that you'll see. And you've seen many of virtually every company that has the capability or ability to jump into this, whether it be on vaccine research or antiviral research, do just that. And so I'm very proud of the response of the pharmaceutical industry. I think the second thing it does is this industry, right, wrong, or indifferent, self-inflicted wounds or not, was really, viewed very negatively by governments and populations all over the world. In fact, many of the reputational rankings that come out had the biopharmaceutical industry dead last, even lower reputationally than Congress, and that's hard to believe. I think now people, are realizing that this industry does a lot of good, and that it's in the world's interest, it's in our national interest to have a vibrant R&D based biopharmaceutical industry. And so I hope that one lesson that's learned here is that this is a good industry. They're trying to do good things, and perhaps we just need some policy shifts that better balance the needs to provide accessible and affordable medicine, but also invest in innovation and research. And those two really are the two sides of the fulcrum, but they have to be balanced, and you can't have free medicines for all and then expect capital to be invested in long expensive R&D. But you also need to be sensitive that there are people who can't afford medicines, and we need to have access and affordability programs for all. And so if we can find that right balance, I think this could be a really long-term benefit that comes out of this.
And you've been at the forefront of that kind of whole process of really advocating for affordable, affordable drug prices and not gouging, patients. But, at the end of the day, the problem is that I think the general population doesn't understand how many millions and millions of dollars go into developing, even starting a clinical trial and developing a clinical trial, and a number of failed clinical trials because, so many drugs don't end up working. So, the R&D costs are just tremendous. And I think that...
Yeah, I'm actually going to correct you. Millions doesn't...
Billions.
Millions is the wrong word. It's billions. Yeah, it's billions. Drugs are very expensive and costly, and they do require significant capital. I think now, I don't have the data off the top of my head, but I think the average new medicine that's developed costs over $2 billion
oh my God.
To develop. And so, it's a very expensive thing. And then what people get confused by is that after the $2 billion plus is invested, and think about, for every successful $2 billion investment, there are perhaps 10 or 15 unsuccessful programs, because it's science after all. And then the cost of actually making the product, drops dramatically. The cost is all front loaded in the R&D. And so people say, oh, it only costs you $5 to make it. Why are you charging $50?
Yeah.
Well, the $45 goes to recoup the R&D investment that was made, perhaps a year, 5 years, or 7 years ago. And most medicines only get about, 7 years of commercial protection as an invention, and then they become generic drugs, and they become more or less free for the world. And so there are very few things where you invest that much money to create a medicine or treatment, generate some intellectual property or patents, and then several years later, the world takes it over for free. Could you imagine if the iPhone, after 6 years, became free to everybody? That what would Apple look like today? And so it's a very different business model that is hard to understand.
Yeah, no, it's challenge. And I think the other misunderstanding is that, there have been, I feel like, again, I'm not in the pharmaceutical industry, but I feel like so many breakout drugs have come out, especially in, you were talking about orphan, oncology, virology, and so forth. I think, the private sector has been such an important part of that. Obviously, the universities and the NIH fundings have been also a very important part of that. But if it wasn't for the private sector, I think, the world would be looking very different from a healthcare standpoint.
I think that's true of all commercial enterprises, right? So, what would the world look like? What would many, different commercial enterprises look like if we didn't have GPS? And GPS was kind of like NIH, develops the basic science for a lot of things that ultimately become commercial enterprises. Well, GPS was developed by the military, and then it had a commercial application. And, that is what government should be there to do, is basic research and, planting seeds to stimulate economic opportunity, innovation, and ingenuity to make better products, better lives, better solutions. But, this idea that NIH, for example, is going to solve the vaccine, that's just not going to happen. The way the vaccine for this pandemic is going to come, it's going to come from, private industry, using their best resources to solve a major problem for the world.
So speaking of that, you are at the forefront, and you have been for so many years. What do you think, and of course no one has a crystal ball, but what do you think the prospects of a breakout drug or vaccine and the timing of it, based on how fast it feels like you said, this is almost like an arms race of how fast people are kind of getting into this space. What do you think the prospects are?
Yeah, I mean, on this one, I'm optimistic, and I'm also very proud because, like I said, any company in our industry that has vaccine capabilities, and Merck being the last one to jump in yesterday, has jumped into this endeavor to try to solve this problem. And my 2 cents, for what it's worth, is they're not doing it for a profit. That these are not going to be profitable vaccines. They're going to be more or less given away at cost or close to cost or cost plus. J&J has already said they're going to, if they're successful, they're going to do it on a non-for-profit basis. These companies are jumping in this to solve a problem for humanity, not as a capitalist. And so that's part one. I think part two is all over the world, we have some of the best minds working on this. And I'm very optimistic that we will not only have one, but we should have multiple vaccines targets identified and ready for production before the end of this calendar year, which is light speed. Normally vaccines take 7 to 10 years to develop. I think the issue then is, they have to scale up and manufacture it, and that will push, availability for the masses into the spring of next year. And so we have to distinguish, when you hear in the media, between when a vaccine is identified and when a vaccine is available. There will be several months of scale up and manufacture that has to happen. And a quick anecdote, I was talking to a very senior real estate executive, a builder that is one of the biggest in the country. And he asked me, he said, well, why can't we just get a vaccine? I don't understand. And I said, let me try to put it in your industry. I said, there's an empty lot on the corner of, XYZ Street in New York City. Why can't I have a 90-story skyscraper tomorrow? We know how to do it. We know how to build a building. And he said, well, we need to do environmental studies. I got to get zoning. I got to build a foundation. I have to order steel. I said, well, how do you think we make a vaccine? We just don't, it just doesn't happen tomorrow. We have to do all the safety studies. We have to make sure the long-term safety is appropriate and balances the risk. And then, you actually have to build, sterile manufacturing environments to produce it. And so it's not something that just appears. It takes a lot of investment, a lot of hard work, and a lot of ingenuity. But it's coming. I'm very optimistic we're going to solve it.
Well, I want to give you one kudos that, you've been on social media. I feel like you've done such a great job of really posting information, because oh my God, how many posts do we see about just like ridiculous non-scientific stuff? And I really, really enjoy kind of following you in terms of how you are really trying to put information that's useful for the public on your social media. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's when it started, when the pandemic and the lockdown started, there was so much misinformation that I woke up one day after reading some silly article. I think it was on Twitter, actually. And I said, you know what, I'm going to just use, for the rest of the time till we get to a stable place, I'm going to use my stories function on Instagram to predominantly or near exclusively try to put out information that may not always be right, but that I've filtered, that I've thought through, that I've consulted other experts on, that I think is important for people to see. And so I try to curate it. Sometimes, I put something out and a week later, it's not valid anymore. I try to correct it, but it is curated and done with good intent. And what's interesting, actually, as an aside, is one thing that maybe people haven't thought about, but with all the different headlines and all the different things, this works, this doesn't work, you got to do this, you got to do that, wear a mask, don't wear a mask. What people are seeing is science in action. And this is a novel virus. That's why we called it the novel coronavirus. We've only known about it for a few months. And the amount of information we know about it and our ability to sequence it and understand it and learn about it is unprecedented. But yet, everybody's expecting instant gratification, and that just doesn't happen in science and medicine, as you know well. And so I know people think, oh, there's this, there's that. Why are they changing their minds? Why is the policymakers of the government doing this? But that's just how science works. And as we learn things, we'll figure out some things work or some things we thought worked didn't work. But ultimately, as we get more experience with this virus and the impact on it, we'll understand how to deal with it, how to treat it, how to vaccinate against it. But that just, that takes a lot of trial and error and a lot of stops and starts. We as doctors or biopharma folks, we've known that this is how science and medicine works forever. It just now the general public is getting to see it on display, which is interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like a reality series of like really day-to-day, minute-to-minute action about what is happening in the medical world. and with drugs that are being tried and the research and all the information out there. So, and sometimes it's information overload, and that kind of then the real science gets lost when you do that. So I really appreciate that. The other thing I have to say, just getting back to you, I felt like I'm a facial plastic surgeon, so I have been using Allergan products for 17 years. But one thing I've been very impressed with you saying on the social media as well as all other things is that you really, you were CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but you were really connected to the physicians and to your essentially customers. I know the end user is the final customer, but your doctors also are. How did that develop for you, just as a leader, as an executive? Because I find that to be very unique.
The social media piece of it, or
social media, but just like going to conferences, I felt like you really knew a lot of your customers, and it's not like a few doctors. It's thousands of doctors that you were connected. You use social media, but you also just like, I feel like you really kind of came, you're connected to us as the users of your products.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think it goes back to, when I began in this industry almost 20 years ago. I had a mentor, a really amazing man named Fred Hassan, who has since retired, but someone I actually still stay in touch with. And he instilled in me something, and then, over time I've expanded on it, but that is really to understand your products and your customer. And when I have a consumer related product, I can try it myself. I can hear from people who've used it, what happens. But when you're dealing with a prescription medicine or a implantable device or other things like that, it's really hard to get firsthand experience. So I started really trying to understand from the physician's perspective, how our products worked and what the positives and negatives were, and where we needed better innovation or better design. And that's because ultimately it's the physicians and the frontline nurses and others that get the best feedback on our products, because it's very hard for us to know and talk to our patients. That's your job as a physician. That's not my job. And so understanding that, I just really felt like the best way to know my business and to know the needs and opportunities and areas for improvement was to just be incredibly close to the customer. And I just view that as so important. I know so many CEOs that are so detached from the reality of their business. They're great people. They're incredibly intelligent people, but they really are detached from the actual business that they're running from a day-to-day perspective. And I think that's a mistake.
So you've done an amazing job, and I really congratulate you on that. And I think it's a big part of, what I admire about you. Now, what's next for you? What do you have any hobbies? Are you like going to take a little bit of time to kind of, time off? You've been busy for, like you said, over 20 years, leading major companies. What's next for you?
Yeah, so currently I'm unemployed. I'm doing some consulting work for AbbVie to help finish the transition and integration. But I do find myself with some more free time than I've had in probably 20 plus years. But it's very recent, and we've only finished this deal 2 weeks ago. And I kind of live by a principle during the integration, and especially true given the pandemic and the extra, initiative that required on our team's part and my part, was to not really look for or think about another job till I was finished with the one I had. So I'm at the very early days of thinking about what's next for me. The only thing I can tell you that the pandemic and perhaps the last 2 weeks have taught me, which is that I have more energy, more ambition, and more drive to work full time and do something where I feel I can have an impact and make a difference, and hopefully be intellectually stimulated than I did before. So I'm pretty anxious to get back in the saddle, but I'm going to wait to do it the right way and try to spend a little bit more time with my daughters and other things like that till I find what's next for me.
It's been interesting because as we were talking before we started, the last 2.5 months have really kind of allowed me, because I've been, going nonstop, I feel like since the 10th grade, when I started really getting serious about my academics. And, it's nice to have a little bit of pause. I think it really gives you that opportunity. So I wish you nothing but the best. And I'm so really, honestly, thank you so much for taking your time. I know you're busy and you're like on CNBC and all these really, major outlets. So I appreciate you taking time to be on this podcast. And I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, well, I would like to just thank you for having me, but also thank you for what you do to help make, your profession in the area that I hold dear to my heart a better profession, and keeping your patients at the front and center is just, it's so important, and I admire everything you do. So just thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. And you, I hope, have a great, healthy, safe rest of your few months until we're through this pandemic. And I hope we can chat again.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a great time. And thank you to everyone for listening in, and we'll see you next time.